So there are so many ways we can think about contemporary Black Lives Matter today, and what's kind of happening. I have some sort of issues to address, some sort of overall ideas and concepts, and then we'll have to move on to something else. Unfortunately, I would like to spend more time with it, but it's just not that realistic. Unfortunately, as we've talked about, and as statistics show, Black people are 3.3 times more likely to be killed than white people by police. And this constant fear of violence and issues surrounding police violence as a whole, even as people continue to protest peacefully, which is legal and legal to us under the Constitution. You have that Black lives and the lives of protesters are continually to be threatened by the police and other forces. And I've been happy to see Black Lives Matter protests and art in Milwaukee, such as this one that is in the intersection of Locust and MLK, which they continue to repaint so that it is visible. Others in Milwaukee, like that on North and Holton for George Floyd. Holton and Locust for Breonna Taylor. We've also seen some showing up in Washington, D.C. as well. We've also seen controversies come from this with the painting of Black Lives Matter in cities this one is in Florissant, Missouri, and then the covering up of that as well, while the police say that first it was causing confusion and attracting onlookers to a busy 4-lane stretch of road, also saying that it is illegal to paint on a roadway, even though people continue to do this, obviously, as well. There are some popular mottos of the group as well, or sort of, I don't know, catchphrases, phrases, no justice, no peace. And I did a little bit of putting together some history of those phrases. So the first is no justice, no peace. This was a political slogan of violence against African Americans by white Americans, though the sort of precise meaning is contested and who sort of invented it and why. It was believed to be first used in the murder of Michael Griffith at the hands of a white mob. Michael Griffith was with a group of friends, and he ran from the mob onto the highway and got struck by an oncoming car. He was from Trinidad and had immigrated there in 1973, and many people said that it very much felt like a racist scenario of people fleeing from being lynched in the South. It very much had this sort of very negative feeling of kind of lynching from the past. These men, young boys, were convicted of murder. But it was a large part of these racial killings that were happening in the 1980s in New York City. His being in the middle, starting with Willie Turks in 1982 and Yusuf Hawkins in 1989. And this just continued to be this incessant violence happening against white citizens Black citizens by sort of white mobs or groups. And so protesting was occurring all over the city of New York for Michael Griffith and the lives of Willie Turks and then eventually Yusuf Hawkins. Yusuf was also a young Black man who was 16 years old, and he was shot in Bensonhurst, which is a working class neighborhood in New York City, in Brooklyn. He had gone with his friends to a neighborhood to inquire about a car, but they were lying in wait for him. Hawkins seemed to have dated a girl in the neighborhood, and they wanted to hurt him. Some sort of controversy about potentially sort of a relationship that he had. And Hawkins and the Free Friends were attacked by a crowd of 10 to 30 white youths, while at least 7 of them wielding baseball bats. and one of them was armed with a handgun and shot Hawkins twice, killing him. It was considered to be an act of violence and racial violence at that. And we have figures like Al Sharpton coming out here, who's quite different from what he looks like today, we'll see, coming to protest the death of Yusuf Hawkins during that time. So much so that Al Sharpton was even stabbed at one of the protests in 1991 and seriously wounded. But he's fine, luckily. But we saw insane violence occur during this time against Black protesters in general. And you even had sort of counter protests in Bensonhurst as well by a working class neighborhood because believing that these kind of racial protesting were against their neighborhood as a whole. And this is something that's kind of long stained New York and sort of their feeling about race and the divide between sort of the police force as well. Others say the popular Robert Sonny Carson in 1987 sort of cited the first time it really became popularized, this phrase, saying, "You don't give us any justice, then there ain't going to be no peace." I don't know why I couldn't read that. "We're going to use whatever means necessary to make sure that everyone is disrupted in their normal life." Other people cite sort of popular instances of it being used, like in the Los Angeles riots in 1992, because of the Rodney King events that took place after police officers were acquitted. That it was very much part of the protesting during that time as well. It could have also surrounded being used in print in 1999 following the murder of Joseph Gould, who was a homeless man who was killed by an off-duty Chicago police officer. And this chant was "No justice, no peace, no racist police." According to Al Sharpton, it started being used 2014 as a rally cry. And we've seen him appear again. We talked about Al Sharpton just a minute ago, and this is sort of thin and fit Al Sharpton. But he has continued to protest for Eric Garner, as well as George Floyd. Some people saying that "No justice, no peace" was really sort of something he supported and created, but he doesn't seem to say that at all in his own sort of work. There are other phrases that even are sort of more... I haven't really found sort of a clear idea of where this idea of silence is violence, white silence equals white violence. I don't know if we have a good idea of where it came from yet, unless someone else can find something. I was trying to sort of get to the core of what this idea means, or sort of where it came from, that is, because I do know what it means. And there's a lot of interesting controversy and conversations about this. We have sort of the conversations about what it means, meaning for white organizational leaders, that means a systemic racism that is a recognized part of American society. It also means during particularly public flare-ups of violence against Black Americans. It can also mean when peaceful protests are met with police violence and ugly behavior to precipitate the most dramatic civil unrest in half a century. And worse, silence is complicit in this justice. I found it interesting enough that this is even sort of a phrase that Aubrey Lorde is using in her work. Remember us talking about her very shortly ago. She said in her work, "I was going to die if not sooner than later, whether or not I had ever spoken myself. My silence had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. But if for every real word spoken, for every attempt I had ever made to speak those truths for which I am still seeking, I have more contact with the other women while we examined the words to fit a world in which we all believed bridging our differences." It's also interesting to find books where people are coming out and speaking against sort of white supremacy and white violence among sort of white authors and white figures, breaking down the issues with white complicity and people who do not speak out as being part of this sort of white violence. Barbara Applebaum being one of them, as cited in an article I'm going to show you here shortly. But don't worry, James Lindsay will tell all of you that you shouldn't feel bad about it. It's not a real problem anymore, which is interesting. And also, you're white and a man, so cool. My take on it is that silence is death or silence is violence comes from the sort of AIDS crisis protesting, and maybe they got it from Black Lives Matter protests, sort of pre 2014. But this phrase was used as a part of AIDS crisis in the 1980s and 90s in New York City, where you had ACT UP using this, as well as Keith Haring creating some work revolving around it. Very much having to do with political silence by the government, along with Ronald Reagan, doctors not working to create cures. And what that actually meant was silence equals death, right? People were afraid, people were scared, people were dying and not knowing why, claiming that AIDS was a only transmitted by drug users or homosexuals. So all of these issues really led to silent is death. People were actually dying from a disease that no one wanted to talk about. So I very much see very specific similarities between that and like some of the Black Lives Matter posters. But I would love to hear you guys' thoughts on that as well. It also makes me start to think about Blue Lives Matter and what this kind of movement means as sort of a counter movement to Black Lives Matter. I actually didn't know that it was developed in 2014 after the killing of Rafael Ramos and Wen Jianlu, who were killed by this man here after he killed them because of the deaths of Eric Garner and Michael Brown. And so people in Louisiana and other states and cities were working to make sure that the killing of police officers would be charged under a hate crime, which actually protects people outside of race, sexual orientation, gender identity, to start including now career choices. I read somewhere equating a removal of a uniform with a person's race and blue racism. So this group was developed because of the violence against police officers during the 2014 death of Eric Garner. And you can hear all about how Randy Sutton thinks that there's a war against police officers. And the Blue Lives Matter flag, where the blue line signifies cops and duty that keep society from erupting into chaos, which of course has followed up with racist connotations as it's often carried in conjunction with Confederate flags. There are also some issues about war on cops, which seems to be statistically incorrect. Even to the fact that I went to the 2020 War on Cops website, and it appears like more cops have died from COVID than anything else. But I'll post that on the canvas if you guys want to read about it. And of course, this leads into conversations about all lives matter, and the sort of racist issues that come up with saying all lives matters and then blue lives matter, even though blue lives are not existent, right? Like no one is blue. I guess I don't. How do you even equate a career with a race or a gender? A police officer is not a social construct. It's not constructed under racism over hundreds of years. I mean, 2014, it's 6 years of violence I don't know. Anyway, we have crazy organizations such as Paper Beats Rock, and making sure to fight people who are causing the right race to suffer from white guilt. And you start ending up in this rabbit hole where you are, well, maybe it's just me, where you see things on Facebook like the death of Cannon Hinnant, being shot on August 9th by his black neighbor. And all that people care about is comparing his life to George Floyd, saying that, we're willing to talk about George Floyd, who's a drug overdose, and he overdosed on methamphetamine, but we don't care about this young boy who was shot in the head. And it's okay, we'll say his name. Don't worry. Someone will care. Reverse the racism. This is the only thing anyone talks about for his month. Say his name. Where's the outrage, right? And of course, using a white child and his death to make the Black Lives Matter movement not as valuable somehow, or to use his life as a scapegoat, as an excuse, as a deflection, right, is horrific. To say that his life is more important than anybody else's life, well, congratulations. I guess that's exactly the point that we're making. And I start to get into these like deep thoughts about like what's going on in the country and why people want to protest, even though Hinnant's murderers were caught and protected, caught and sentenced, and yet we want to talk about racism surrounding Kamala Harris. I mean, the way that we're talking about this black woman, again, Bell Hooks, where are you? Her parents have PhDs, and thus now she's claiming to be black and live in the hood. She is not a black woman. She cannot relate to the lower class or those who are homeless. She is spending other people's money. She had a sexual affair with a married man. Trying to use her, a black woman, to demonize who she is and what she stands for, to say that she's too incredibly mean to Brett Kavanaugh, a rapist. And made him cry. He cried a lot. To the point that people are literally claiming that she is not black. She's not American black. What the, like, what? I have a clip from Trevor Noah for you guys to watch.
Some have challenged her racial identity and criticized her for identifying as black when her parents are Jamaican and Indian.
When we talk about, quote, African American, her father is from Jamaica. He isn't from Africa. He's from Jamaica. So she's not really an American black.
Kamala Harris is not an African American. If you dare raise that, you're attacked. But the truth is she's not.
She's not African American. She doesn't have slave blood. She's not down for the struggle.
She's constantly talking how she went to an historically black college. She is adopting Oakland as her hometown, even though she grew up from the age of 7 to the age of 18 in Canada.
Kamala Harris descended from the largest slave owner in Jamaica. Kamala Harris seems to be descended less from the legacy of, let's say, Frederick Douglass than she is from the legacy of the plantation itself.
Wow, that is fascinating, and I know a lot of people haven't heard that before, Dinesh.
Okay, first of all, being partly descended from a slave owner is one of the blackest things that can happen to you. In fact, you know who was also the descendant of a slave owner? Frederick Douglass. Yeah. So the guy you just tried to use as an example of someone who is super black is also, by your metric, not black enough. Look, ma'am, you can dissect Kamala Harris's heritage however you want. But to say she's not black? Ask yourself this question. Is she black enough to get kicked out of a restaurant back in the day in the Jim Crow South? Huh? Would she have been black enough to get redlined? Is she black enough to be kept out of a whites-only school as a little girl? Then she's black. People will be like, oh, you're not black, you're not black. There's a little simple test here. You know how you know you're black? If you're dating a white person, and before you meet their parents for the first time, they start a sentence with, hey, listen, so before we head inside, you're black. And what's especially ironic about these people?
And maybe it's this sort of continued dialogue that sort of gets under my skin, and maybe made this whole second half of the presentation too emotional, is that as we continue to sort of denounce protests and violence, and we talk about, oh, well, peaceful protesting is okay, but what about violence? What about Antifa? What about the burning of public buildings? What about the stores that are being burned down? The police need to keep order. So what are they supposed to do? I found myself getting very frustrated towards the end of finishing this presentation. And as you sort of see all of these events and these things that connect to one another, like the Greensboro sit-in at the counter here, where white people came and terrorized the individuals as they sat in solidarity, trying to stop the segregation of restaurants. And they were dragged out by their hair. Or the Freedom Riders, who were civil rights activists riding interstate buses to challenge the non-enforcement of the desegregation of buses that was burned. The mob followed the bus in automobiles, and when the tires on the bus blew out, someone threw a bomb into the bus. The Freedom Riders escaped the bus as it burst into flames, only to be brutally beaten by the members of the surrounding mob. The second bus, a Trailways vehicle, traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, and those riders, who were also beaten by an angry white mob, many of whom brandished metal pipes. Birmingham Public Safety Commissioner Bull Connor stated that although he knew the Freedom Riders were arriving and violence awaited them, he posted no violence, no police protection at the station, because it was Mother's Day. And maybe these figures seem semi-familiar to you, and maybe they don't. One of them stood out to me. Included John Lewis, one of the most famous civil rights activists, stated later in life, "We were determined not to let any act of violence keep us from our goal. We knew our lives could be threatened, but we had made up our minds not to turn back." Or even the April 1976 busing demonstration, where Ted Landsmark, a 29-year-old educated lawyer, was violently assaulted with the American flag. Became this sort of landmark photograph for violence. So, as a white woman, to sit here and be exhausted and find myself sort of exhausted with this movement as a whole, it resonates a lot that the people are mad, and with good reason, that when violence is discussed, when Black lives are discussed, that this is the kind of setbacks that they still experience. I've included the clip where Bell Hooks talks about Black Lives Matter, as well as some phrases as well, which I am not going to talk about right now. But I have included in this PowerPoint, so take a look. I apologize for this semi-emotional breakdown of this movement, but it's difficult and complicated, especially as we're living it right now. And so many things that will be developed and understood and contemplated further. And we have to sort of think about where we stand in all these things. We're going to be reflecting on gender performance next week. I will talk to you all then.